Hey class, so in this video we're going to talk about speciation. So remember, this is talking about the development of new species. Right? So the idea of common ancestry leading to different kinds of things is what we're looking at with speciation. Right? And first I want to tell you biologically what we're talking about with the species. This was something that was in the pre-lecture assignment, but I want to mention this. So when we're looking at biological species, if we're looking at two things, one's A, one's B, and we're saying, hey, these are different species, right? That's A, that's B, that's a cardinal, that's a blue jay, different species. What does it mean? Like, what causes them to be different species? And there's two things. There's basically two criteria for being different kinds of species or the same, depending on how you're looking at it. So biological species, if they are members of the same species, so if they are the same species, they have to be able to breed and have viable offspring. Okay, they have to breed, so they have to be able to reproduce, and the offspring from those reproductions have to be viable, meaning they have to also be able to reproduce. So if two things are the same exact species, both of these must occur. Now, sometimes there are barriers in place that may stop breeding, right? So for example, here's an easy one. Something lives in the Atlantic Ocean, something lives in the Rocky Mountains. Obviously, those two things are not going to be breeding, right? So that's an extreme example. It's an easy example, but that's what we're talking about. Like if they can't reproduce, then they can't be the same species, right? So they have to be able to do these two things to be considered the same. So in this example, like these are different. So why are they different? Well, they would be different because they either can't breed, so they can't reproduce, and or they can't make viable offspring, right? So we're saying they're different. That means we're kind of violating one of these two criteria. All right, so there's two major ways we get speciation. One is called allopatric. Both of these were in the pre-lecture assignment. Hey, allopatric speciation, it requires some kind of geographic barrier. Right, so we have a population here. We can just use letters here. So this population of A, whatever A happens to be. And then let's say we get this population split by some geographic barrier. So I'll give you two examples. I know that's a horrible picture, but mountains. Splits these populations in two. And at this time, they're still A, right? Both of those things are still A. Or maybe an ocean. So my pathetic attempt at drawing mountains was enough, so we just make a note here. Maybe it's an ocean that does the separation, some kind of geographic barrier. And then ultimately over time, one or both of these populations adapt differently. Now, if you've ever been out west, Rocky Mountains, the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, like foothills, prairies, grassy, dry kind of stuff. If you go to the western side of the Rocky Mountains, well, it's very wet, very green, very lush, lots of trees. A lot of times you even see it described as a temperate rainforest. It's so green and lush and wet. Okay, so the habitats, the environment on different sides of this mountain chain could be different. It most likely will be different. So then what we're saying is that over long periods of time, one of these things diverges. And then now we have this new species. It's still biological evolution by natural selection, right? The environmental factors change. What organisms were there that were are adapting generation to generation to generation. They've accumulated different traits that are specific for that new habitat, and that can make them different. And remember, if you're looking at this going, well, what makes this new species B different from A? Well, sometimes it may, of course, look a lot different, but it doesn't necessarily have to look different, right? If we want to know what makes us say B is different from A, it's this stuff up here, right? That's what we started with, is for B to be different from A, they have to not breed and not produce viable offspring. And that's what we're saying down here now, is that B and A would not be able to breed or make viable offspring. All right, so that's allopatric speciation. That always requires a geographic barrier. And then we have something called sympatric speciation. This doesn't require a geographic barrier. Most of the time this is happening through mutations in the DNA. So one population again, but we're not going to split it. Instead, what we're going to do is have some mutation that occurs. Right? So there's an organism in our population now that has that mutation. And then again, remember, it's natural selection stuff, right? So as long as that mutation had some kind of advantage to it, we could increase its number in the population like this, right? And then at this point, we would basically be saying that whatever X represents, that's a new species. Right? Couple different ways. It's the most common ways of getting speciation events. Normally, this is not 100% always the case, but normally allopatric tends to be an animal kind of thing. So like Sierra Nevada mountains out in California, there's some salamander species that have fairly recently gone through allopatric speciation because of the mountain chain. The Sierra Nevada mountains are relatively young, so like they're still kind of splitting up habitats. So allopatric's typical for animals. Sympatric is typical for plants. A lot of plant species have evolved by mutations in genes that lead to sympatric speciation. All right, so that's a little bit of speciation, what it is, and how we're doing it.